Good morning, everyone. I'm Elisif Elvinsdotter. I'm my first time here, so I'm a journalist and moderator in Sweden, where I worked a lot on infrastructure. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. And welcome to the Transport Innovation Talks. It's a kind of TED Talk, where we'll listen to a number of interesting speakers with interesting ideas. And if you need interpretation, you see the channels over there and up on the screen, so you can tune in and get translation in 4 different languages. And we have 4 innovative stories for you this morning, each one connected to how we use data, how we can be mapping patterns and opening up new possibilities. Will the future city be seeing and anticipating your needs? Will you enter a new city anywhere in the world and use an app to connect you with the kind of transport that you want? Can your parking system be intelligent, showing you the nearest available spot? Or will you in the future use some kind of private transport system to take you where you want to go? Each one of our speakers will hold a 15-minute presentation, and at the end of the session we'll have about 20 minutes where we will open up to questions from you in the audience. So please wait with your questions until the end of the session, as all of these talks sort of interlink with each other, giving different perspectives upon the same subject. So we're talking a lot about the self-driving cars these days. But what if the future is not about the autonomous car, but about the autonomous city? If all the data we create on different levels every day were put together, we'd get a city that is kind of like a symbiotic being. Please welcome Carlo Ratti, who is director at MIT SENSEable City Laboratory.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Could we have the slides? Perfect. So what I wanted to do today with you is actually share some of the work we're doing at MIT SENSEable City Lab, both in Boston and in Singapore, about mobility. And really the scale of the city, which is the focus of what we do. Now, I want to start with this picture. This is a picture that people used to be really fascinated in the 1990s. People thought that our world would become increasingly virtual, and because of that, physical space would be less and less important. 1995, there was a book called, in the 90s, there was a book called The Death of Distance by a person called Cairncross. 1995, Gilder wrote, cities will disappear because of digital and so on. We will not need cities anymore. Cities are leftover baggage from the industrial era. Well, this tells you how difficult it is actually to make predictions about the future, because no prediction could have been more wrong than this one. We now know that actually cities have been thriving despite digital. That's a picture from China. China this century is planning to build more urban fabric than all of humanity ever built. We know that since 2008, half of the world's population lives in cities, and this number could swell to 5 billion by 2030. So what has happened is actually that digital hasn't killed physical space. Digital hasn't removed the need for traveling, for moving physically over space, or the need to have cities, but something else is happening, which actually digital and physical kind of recombining in our cities. It's like, the worlds of bits and atoms converging with us in the middle. And that, what I'll try to show is that, is actually opening up great possibilities, potential to understand the cities in a different way, to analyze them, and, to have different transportation systems and so on. We now can see, for instance, a city like this. This is a picture of Lisbon, mapped using billions and billions of data points from the taxi network. Something we couldn't do just a few years ago, we can now do and understand the city almost as a living organism. And when you have all this data, then you can analyze it. This is a project we're doing in New York. It's about to be published. So what you see here is actually all of the pickups and drop-offs of taxis in New York. You see Manhattan in the middle, and you see all the rest of the city. And then you can ask yourself, well, what if we actually people could share a taxi ride? Again, that's something you couldn't do a few years ago, but you can very easily do today because we've got real-time information in our pockets. The same reason why many of the apps that we use today that weren't working a few years ago is really because we got this ability to know in real time other people who might want to go the same route or need similar things in the city. So a very simple idea. So that's, just the idea. The question is, we're interested in research, so this is not about implementing this in New York. Different people, startups are looking at this. But from a research point of view, you can then ask yourself, imagine you have all this information about taxis in your city, and then what would be the minimum number of taxis if people were willing to share in order to take everybody to their destination when they need to be there? Well, if you look at this question is difficult to answer with traditional systems. Here you enter the field of big data in cities. And traditionally, you would have looked at this question using linear programming, but when you got this huge amount of data, then it becomes difficult to use traditional techniques. So what we did here was actually develop a new network science-based approach in order to look at all trips, these kind of billions and billions of trips or data points in New York City. You see the trips there. See all the trips that were shareable. And what you see here is actually the shareability, how many you can share, based on a small tolerance. You can say, I want to take everybody to their destination, give or take, whatever, 30 seconds, or 1 minute, or 1.5 minutes, which is what you see down there. And you see that as you actually expand that window, the network densifies. You see to the left and to the right, when you expand it, you've got more trips that can actually be shared. Well, if you do all the analysis and you process all the trips in New York, and then also in other cities, what you find is quite surprising that it could actually satisfy the same mobility demand with little over 50% of the infrastructure you have today. So you could remove over 40% of the cars that you have in the city and still take everybody to their destination when they need to be there. So quite a substantial change. And the interesting thing you see on this graph is actually that the curve saturates very fast. So we all know that in New York, taxis are a huge chunk of traffic and congestion and so on. But even if you take a city with less taxis, with a lower density, you get the same ability to share and you saturate to get to 100% sharing very, very, very quickly. So this is about how this data component can help us to understand better what's going on in the city and how we can respond to that information. The same is also happening inside the car. The city is becoming more intelligent or smarter. The car is also becoming more intelligent. In the next project, for instance, we're looking at inside the car, how we can actually collect a lot of information inside the car. In this case, for looking at road frustration.
Incredibly stressful. It was the most stressful drive I've ever been on. Nevertheless, I think we have a lot of great content to measure road frustration because I'm certainly frustrated at this point.
This wasn't planned.
Okay. Stop the car.
So we were just sideswiped. And right now my stress level should be through the roof. We got the information, we'll have to process the data and see where it's really at.
So the city is becoming more and more intelligent. We collect a lot of information in the city. The car is becoming more and more intelligent, knows a lot of things about ourselves, about the frustration, about what is around itself. Out of the intersection of these two things, something extraordinary is happening, which is what was mentioned before, which is self-driving cars. In our case, however, we got a number of self-driving cars at MIT. We're working with different groups. Google has some, and many other companies and universities worldwide have developed the cars. The technology is getting very, very close to being mature. There are some issues in order to deploy them because of insurance and many other things that you're familiar with. But the interesting thing, we believe, is not really the self-driving car itself. It's not about not needing to keep your hands on the steering wheel or being able to shamelessly send text messages while you're driving. The point is something else. The point is that when you got this in the city, then everything changes from the point of view of public and private transportation. So when you got this in the city, then the car can give you a lift in the morning to go to work, and then can give a lift to somebody else in your family or anybody else in the city. So effectively, you're blurring the distinction between private and public transportation. And when you do that, so we're actually working in Singapore and looking at quantifying this. Again, our goal is to look at what is the impact on the city. Well, when you look at this, which is car sharing, so sharing the same vehicle not at the same time, but one person after the other, if you combine this with what we saw before about New York, about sharing the ride, not the car, but the ride, so at the same time, potentially, you could actually have a city where you take everybody to their destination exactly when they need to be there, but actually removing out of the streets 4 cars out of 5. Now imagine how would most of our cities look like if you were to remove 4 cars out of 5 in terms of parking spots, all the space you would free. If you think about it, it's a huge amount of infrastructure that's totally wasted today. We just use it for half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours per day, and then all the rest, the other 22 hours or 23 hours, you're just sitting and being a nuisance somewhere in the city, not being used. So actually, that shows that the impact on the city could be quite extraordinary. Now, if you look at this and you look a bit further down the line, so think about, according to some prediction, 2040 or 2050, then you can look at other changes. Now, we didn't have traffic lights once upon a time. Traffic lights started a little over 100 years ago when actually we got cars on the road. But now if car becomes intelligent, and if you actually have a condition where every car is a self-driving car, then you can think about a situation without traffic lights anymore. A situation where actually flows will magically mix without bumping into each other. You can look at something like this. Don't try it yet. Actually, I gave this presentation in Naples, and people told me, well, we do it already. Well, again, we are interested in research, so we're interested in quantify some of this. So this is actually, this piece here is an algorithm that has been developed by some colleagues in the United States, but not by our group. But actually, we're looking at the platform to quantify what would happen then. What is most efficient if you get a system of slots, and how can you compare different systems with the same safety level? Because it's easy to design algorithms that will allow you to do this, but how can you actually have the same safety level or increase safety compared to what we have today? And again, you develop some interesting mathematics in order to analyze this, to analyze the crossing and see how it works. And what you see again, it's quite interesting. What you see here is actually a traffic light, the same amount of cars coming. This is actually taken from a crossing in Singapore, from a junction in Singapore. And what you see, look at the left and the right, and that is being analyzed by the delay you're introducing on the system, how long people have to wait because of queuing, and also by the capacity. And what you see here to the left, you see how quickly then you get a lot of queuing. So people have to wait a lot with a traditional traffic light system, and that's having exactly the same safety in both cases in terms of distances and the ability to stop before bumping into somebody else. So, all of this is to say these are some of the interesting things about the impact of self-driving on the city and how we can start to quantify it. Now, of course, we can do a lot of research like this, but then the important thing is how can we actually test it? And what we are trying to do now is work with the government in Singapore, where we have a part of the lab, in order to do hopefully the world's first ever a testbed where we got actually quite a large number of self-driving cars that people can call with their cell phone. They will give you a lift, give a lift to somebody else. So, hopefully in the island of Sentosa. But anyway, that's one of the designs we're working on. Sentosa is a small island next to Singapore. As you probably know, it's just an ideal testbed in order to try out a fleet of new self-driving cars. And so in the last couple of minutes, all of this about self-driving and autonomy in the field of cars and their impact on the city. But as you know, autonomy actually is working, it's been developed in many other fields. And so I wanted to share with you a project we did at MIT. Now you need to know that if you have been to our campus is a little bit messy. Our campus, there's plenty of buildings, every building has a different name, a different number. A lot of people get lost on the campus. So we actually decided to do a project based on autonomy in order to help them, and also in particular, in order to help the poor Harvard students.
Welcome to MIT. Where would you like to go? Follow me, please. The largest research lab at MIT.
To your right, the Media Lab. To your left, the Data Center.
Follow me, please. Approaching your destination.
You have arrived. Welcome to SENSEable City Lab.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
So, Carlo, I have to ask you, this all looks like science fiction, right? And you've been named one of the 50 most influential designers in America. And when I looked you up on Wikipedia, you're also called engineer, inventor, educator, and activist. And given all this that you're working on, I'm just curious about what is your vision of the future? Like 2050, when we're going to try to battle all the carbon emissions, what would your city look like?
Well, let me say, as I was saying before, the first slide I showed, it's very difficult actually to think how things will be. You really don't try to predict the future. That's basically impossible. But what we can do, and actually that's what we see as our role at MIT, in our lab, in the things we do and many other people do, is actually what we can do is, do a little bit what Alan Kay used to say. You cannot predict the future, but what you can do is try to invent it. What you can do is try to propose things. And then, it's a little bit like the evolution, the natural evolution, but in technology, it's actually proposing new things that then some of them will be successful, some of them will not be successful in the same way as it happens with natural evolution, but actually try to propose possibilities about how cities might evolve. And hopefully also to try to propose good possibilities that can actually make our cities, safer or more sustainable, using less energy, and ultimately, making sure that our cities didn't exist once upon a time. Like 7,000 years ago, here in Leipzig, all of us, we wouldn't live in a city. Had not been invented by humanity. We would be all hunter and gatherers. And then this beautiful invention of humanity starts. And starts for thousands of years, becomes one of the greatest production that we've done together, always with the same goal. The goal is really to be together, to travel, to meet each other, and to make sure that the total is more than the sum of the individual parts.
Well, we have an exciting future ahead.
You're not convinced?
Yes, I am. I think we have an exciting future ahead. Sure. And there will be more questions for you later. So thank you so much, Carlo.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
So our second talk for this session circles also around data visualization and interactive mapping. The company Stamen Design, they do a lot of mapping and tracking of data in different areas. Data that's also used to create works of art sometimes. And during their work in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, they shone a light upon a whole transport system that are almost like hidden beneath the public one. And this sparked a huge debate around the public transportation system and also around social equality. Please welcome Erik Rodenbach, who's founder and CEO at Stamen Design.
Thanks. Okay, good morning. Thank you for coming so early. I want to talk briefly about making the invisible visible. I have two projects that I think are relevant to this audience that I want to go into some depth on. But I do want to start by showing just a few projects to give you a sense of the range of mapping and data visualization activities that are happening at our shop. We're doing things like visualizing the growing sharing economy of Airbnb. You can start to see, by making very simple maps like this, the growth year on year of the sharing services that companies like Airbnb are pioneering. This is what Airbnb looked like last year. We're having to go back and refactor all of the colors because things are getting too bright. There's just too much going on. This is a continuing theme. We're starting to also do work with companies like Iteris, which is a traffic visualization company in the United States, doing things like trying to help them rethink their interfaces so that rather than just visualizing traffic flows now or traffic flows in the past, we can start to do things like look at the offset between the traffic that's happening now and the traffic that happened in the past. So not just bottlenecks now or bottlenecks in the past, but a way of combining them and combining those views and starting to help them think through what those kinds of views might look like, and really trying to bring a kind of consumer aesthetics to dashboards and things that are traditionally only used by experts. And then we're also doing things like mapping open map data. If you haven't heard of OpenStreetMap, it's a sort of Wikipedia for map data. We do a lot of work with them. And this watercolor project that we put together was really an attempt to kind of stake some new ground for cartography, so that rather than everybody just making the same old Google map over and over again and maybe changing the colors and changing the landscapes, that we would start to make things where you couldn't tell what were made by hand and what were made by the machine. Try and stake out a claim for map making that's partially about function, but also about enjoyment and form. This is Venice, I believe, and that is St. Peter's. So this work is being done by 12 people. We do about 40 projects a year, and you can find out more about that work at stamen.com. But I want to focus on two projects that I think are going to be interesting for this audience, specifically as far as an approach to technical innovation and this kind of wave of data that various speakers have talked about washing over us. This first one is about visualizing without knowing what your answers are, or even what your questions are, but proceeding anyway. We were asked by NASDAQ, the financial exchange in the United States, to help them come up with visualizations of the financial market that weren't just about lines going up and to the right, to help try and build some more public awareness about what actually goes on in the financial markets. What we found was surprising. This represents a minute's worth of stock data on the stock exchange. So 60 seconds from left to right. Each one of the circles is a set of trades. The size of the circle is the number of shares. The vertical axis is the price of that share. And then in this instance, the color is the stock that's being traded. So those two large purple dots here and here represent the same stock being traded at the same value in the same amount. And you can see that there's a lot of variation in here. This purple line that's going regularly is the NASDAQ stock market's robots saying, am I working? Am I working? Am I working? about every second and a half continuously throughout the day. If we change the color to not represent the stock, but to represent the trader, we get a very different picture. The green in this image is Knight Securities, which is the large trading network that released beta software onto the stock exchange a few years ago, and $63 billion evaporated because of those robots dancing with one another in a matter of seconds. Same thing here with color equals stock. We've got lots of different trades going on, and if we change it to trader, we see that Knight is dominant again. So we did a number of these kinds of studies, and we looked at several days worth of trading, and what we found when we started to look around a little bit closer were some images like this that were very surprising. So right in the middle there, you see a concentrated burst of activity, many different stocks being traded, all in very, very small amounts, 1 or 2, that's what all those tiny little dots are. And it has a very definite start, a very definite end, a top and a bottom, but no discernible pattern if you look at it by stock. However, if you look at it by trader, you start to see a different pattern emerge. And that's Goldman Sachs. This is a robot shaking the stock market and waiting for pennies to fall out. We see it again and again throughout the course of the day. Things that look like activity that's semi-structured or semi-random or just kind of strange, when you view them by trader, turn out to be all the work of specific actors. And they have algorithms that they're operating and parameters that they're working inside of to be able to manipulate the stock market in different directions. We were not looking for these robots when we started the project, but they did seem to leap out of the data. So I want to take you through what this looks like when it's in action. These are, every one of these slides that I'm going to show is 1 minute of activity on the stock market. And right now we're all colored by stock. So in the beginning, before the market opens, we have a few robots making some general inquiries. There's one right over there, a few of them right here, making kind of very specific trades. We start to see, as time goes by, this is about 10 minutes before the market opens, some other robots dancing. And then about 5 minutes before the market opens, we get this kind of activity. And if you hold a ruler up to the top and the bottom there, they'll match exactly. That's a robot pinging simultaneously in very small amounts the top of the market and the bottom of the market just to see what's going on, with a lot of undifferentiated activity in between. Again, very, very small trades. Everybody's just trying to see what's going on. Then right here, we have a kind of bizarre collusion between 4 or 5 different robots dancing to drive the price of the stock up dramatically, again, over the course of about a second and a half. Then there's a lull, and then the market opens. So you'll notice these streaks here, right? This is the same actor. These are all the trades that everybody's been getting ready to make. That's Apple, which does a strange kind of fork in the middle. If you notice that, they're going up and down at the same time. That's Google, a large trade here, small trades, and then a kind of forking trades. Again, these are the robots going, where's the value, where's the value, where's the value? And all of this is happening over the course of just a few milliseconds. After about 30 seconds, the market calms down again. And within a minute, we start to see the kind of regular trades that are the basis of the majority of what's going on in the stock market. Now, I'm showing this to you not because I think that you're super interested in the stock market per se, but because I want to sort of illustrate an approach to visualizing data, an approach to approaching a large data set that we didn't know much about, and give you a sense of the kind of process by which you can generate meaning and start to generate understanding about this work. Or sorry, about the data, I should say. I think there's a tendency in a lot of the work that people are doing when they think about analyzing data, especially big data or big transit data, to think about these things as answer-making interfaces, first and foremost. You have a question, you interrogate the data, you look for an answer. I think there's a really large value to be generated in the idea of thinking about these as question-making interfaces, not just about saying, I have a question, here's the data, go analyze it, tell me what the answer is, but to go into it in an exploratory way, especially since this is all new, and think about generating very specific kinds of questions. Visualize the data, lets you see, well, wait, what's that? And then once you see that, then you can have a dialogue with the data, then you can ask an expert, then you have a whole bunch of other choices available to you. But it's not just about using it for analysis, but also about using it as discovery. And the hope with this kind of approach is not only that you generate new insights from your data, but that you generate new kinds of insights, insights that you hadn't perhaps considered before. Our contention is that this way of working is one way to keep ahead of the really rapidly changing technology and the just tremendous new data flows that are coming. I've heard yesterday that people are saying that there's 1,000 times as much data now than there was 5 years ago. There's no way to anticipate exactly what that's going to be and to build tools that can proactively analyze that kind of data. The approach to that has to be about exploration and discovery and not just about analysis. And this way of working lets you act and find value without knowing all the answers ahead of time, and also perhaps without even knowing what the questions are. Lets you take steps towards resolution without knowing what the final stage is. So on the absolute other end of this spectrum of the work that we've been doing with visualization of large data sets is some work we did around a public transit, or rather I should say a private transit network that sprung up in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. That's called the Google Bus Network, or that's the sort of shorthand for it. The situation is that we have a very dense urban network in San Francisco, and we have a very powerful draw of tech jobs in Silicon Valley. And housing is short. A lot of times what's happening is that people are now, rather than driving to work in Silicon Valley and living in San Francisco, the companies are providing these private bus networks for them. And it's a really touchy subject and a kind of controversial thing that's happening in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. There's a lot of issues. What the net effect of one of these buses showing up in your neighborhood is not only easy transport back and forth to Silicon Valley, but also the rents go up dramatically. And this gets on a lot of people's nerves. At the same time, it also takes large numbers of commuters off the roads because it packs them all into a single bus, right? So there's kind of no easy answers here. And in a place where there's no easy answers, strange and weird things happen to fill those gaps. There's a lot of protests going on. It's not so much that there's a lot of them, but the ones that are there are kind of a flashpoint for the kind of simmering discussions that are happening. And the strange thing about this is that there wasn't a kind of public or publicly available map or representation of what all this activity was, even though it was very clear, for example, from these lines of people on the sidewalk, that there was something fundamentally different going on. You get these lines of people on the sidewalk, it's not really clear why they're there. Suddenly this giant bus comes and picks them up and whooshes them away. So we decided to think about this as a project that we wanted to undertake. We had a commission from the 01 Biennial in San Jose to take a look at this kind of strange phenomenon where there was no map and the companies that were driving these buses around wouldn't tell anybody, including us, where these buses were, or what routes they were on, or how many people were on them. And yet you had a situation where corporate logos are stenciled on the sidewalks outside these places, and the schedules are clearly posted in the bus windows. So we asked the city for their research and what they knew about the services. We got this back. This is a sort of smokescreen, a kind of banding together of a lot of the tech companies to put up just enough information to satisfy some requests, but not actually provide very much information. It's kind of a binding together, and a kind of, there's 20 here and 6 there, but not a real clear route. What we realized was that we could get a whole lot more information by searching Foursquare. You put in Google Shuttle into Foursquare, and you get a map that looks like that. So this thing that's sort of being officially denied or kind of, pulled into this kind of and I want to be clear here, I'm not some sort of rebel that I'm trying to, smash the system. I'm looking for information. The point here is so that we can have something that we can all talk about and discuss and not have to, set off protests. But this idea that something that is a sort of giant transportation network that was affecting a lot of people's lives that we couldn't get official answers for, and we turned to the internet for some answers, was really interesting and a kind of key part of the process. So we had a small budget from 01 to do this work, and so what we did was to take some open source software that we had written called Field Papers, which is a project that's designed to let you use paper atlases in order to digitize geographic information. And I have them here. You're welcome to come up and take a look at them. We sent bike messengers out into the street to follow the buses. We sat at the corner of 18th and Dolores in San Francisco and counted the people that gone on and off. We hired people to stand on the corner of 8th and Market to count and take a look at some of these numbers, and started to develop a map of our own. It took about a month to collate all this and pull it back into our studio in San Francisco, and then start to pull it into a GIS system that we could start to use and make some interesting queries on. So this is a kind of geographically correct map of what that bus network looks like. But what we thought was a more interesting thing to do was to publish this work as though it were a transit network. This is what the final result of the project is a map of the private bus lines in San Francisco to Silicon Valley as surveyed by us. And the conceit here was, if this were a public transit network, this is what it would look like. You could get from the Apple bus to the Google bus at Civic Center if you wanted to. But in order to get from the Apple bus to the Facebook bus, you'd have to transfer at Hayden to Visadero. So we like that as a kind of gesture of, like, if it were public, this is what it would look like. And the net effect of it has been quite interesting. There's been a lot of protests and things like that, but also when you see real estate listings for houses that are close to the Google bus, a lot of times these are used in, you'll see this as one of the slides in the presentation. So this kind of appropriation is going on. Something that we had intended to be kind of provocative actually turned out to be a useful piece of infrastructure. So we like the ambiguity of that. But this is kind of the sort of way other end of a kind of complex data visualization project, of actually taking paper and hiring messengers and people on TaskRabbit and going out into the street and crowdsourcing essentially a map of a private transportation network that rides alongside the public one. So in closing, I want to talk about just briefly this idea of collecting and analyzing and reporting. A lot of what I heard in some of the talks yesterday, especially about big data when it comes to transport, was really about, okay, great, we're going to collect this data and we're going to analyze this data and then we're going to report on our findings to the public. And somehow we want the public to trust us that this is, that we've taken the steps along the way to ensure that this is all valid. And I want to suggest to you that there's a few extra steps that could go into that process that could make the whole thing a lot more easier and a lot more enjoyable and valuable for everybody, which is that in between the collecting and the analyzing, you do some visualization. You have somebody do the visualization. And then after you do the reports, you publish the data as well so that other people can do this. And then you repeat. And you do this as a continuous process. So it's not about collecting, reporting, and stopping. It's about a whole process of being open with data, making it public, and making it consumable. From where I sit, perhaps an interesting development to share with you is that people get genuinely excited about transportation data. There are bike challenges. People are doing this stuff for free. They're coming in on the weekends and playing. This is important. And doing work this way is a good way to engage and build trust with citizens, to be open and transparent. There's ways to do that that can be effective and make it work for you. And I guess my final message is that if you don't, people like us are going to come around and do it for you. Vielen Dank. Thank you.
So if I am to ask you one question, your vision of these patterns that you're mapping and the future and the transportation systems, do you see your patterns emerging into what Carlo was just talking about?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean this is now. We were talking about this earlier. It's not. It's almost a. I almost feel behind the times. It's not, there are no data problems anymore. There are no technical problems anymore. Everything is a data problem. Everything is a technical problem. This is the infrastructure that we live in now.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Erik Rodenbach. So how about the possibility to click an app on your phone and get a luxury car to drive you anywhere? But no, it's not an ordinary taxi. It's a completely different system. Please welcome Corey Owens, who is head of Global Public Policy at Uber Technologies.
started the morning by describing to you a future that is, I don't know if it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out, but this is a future that you can see through the fog of war. And then you've got Eric, who's telling you not about the future necessarily, but using amazing data sets to tell you more about today, right? I'm actually here to talk about something a little bit different, something in between, something that exists today, a problem that has plagued everyone in this room, but one that the solution is dangling there in front of us, and we need only seize it. So I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri, and actually that's a lie. I'm from a little town that you had never heard of, but I'm from basically the middle of nowhere in the middle of the country. I then moved to Washington, D.C., which tries very hard to be a big city, but is secretly just kind of like a medium-sized burg. But my partner lives in Istanbul, and so I spent a lot of time there, which is kind of by definition the big city. It is the megapolis of a couple of continents. The one thing that these three cities all have in common is that it is weirdly difficult to get from my house to my friend's house, or from the bar to the next bar, or, God willing, the bar to home eventually. It's incredibly difficult. And this is a really weird problem, because this is a problem that has existed for something approaching 300 years, since the first taxi service emerged in France. How is it possible that it's taken us 300 years to figure out how to safely and quickly get my drunk self home from the bar to my bed? That feels like a surmountable problem, but it's proven to be a very difficult one. So every major city has some kind of public transit system. These are incredibly important. They move very large numbers of people. They are cost effective in terms of a per person moved from that perspective. They also, unfortunately, are not at all flexible. So no matter the public transportation system, you're inevitably going to have a last mile problem. So in Washington, D.C., I live fairly near the metro, but it's still a 20-minute walk. So we still have this problem of flexibility, and the capital expenditures are massive. They are very difficult to overstate. Then you have private transportation. We all got a car, and that's great. Incredibly flexible. Never have a last mile problem. But it's also an incredibly poor sense of scale. This doesn't scale very well. It's incredibly expensive for cities. It's incredibly bad for the environment. And I just had to put up a gratuitous shot of my personal transportation. That's all. So somewhere in between is for-hire transportation. I actually thought it was really interesting that Carlo talked about taxis, and that actually we're talking now, again, with Eric about kind of this quasi-public, quasi-private transportation system. Somewhere in between are taxis. And they have a little bit of both. They're fairly flexible, for sure. They're fairly cheap, yes. But they're also these incredible structural problems for cities. And they're not quite as responsive today as the world that we once imagined. In San Francisco, 35% of taxis, when you call them, just won't show up. 35%. Now, I don't know how many of you are in the private sector, but even in the public sector, no offense, a 35% failure rate, that would never last. In no other world is a 35% total failure rate acceptable. Meanwhile, even when it doesn't fail, 27% of these cabs take 30 minutes to show up. 30 minutes? If I'm the guy who's got keys in my pocket and a beer in my hand, and I have to make a hard choice about what I'm going to do in a less than objective state, 30 minutes? Is that really a time that we want to wait for myself and my beer to make a decision? I think probably not. But this isn't just bad for consumers, it's actually really bad for the drivers as well, and we don't talk about that nearly enough. In every major city, you can find this, a queue of taxis where you have some of the city's most important assets, most important labor pools sitting idle. What does that mean for the driver? It means that you have guys who aren't making money. It means you have guys who are struggling to feed their families. Meanwhile, you have consumers who are pissed at them for not providing a good service. How is it possible that both supply and demand are being failed? The consumer and the driver are both being failed by our system. Ultimately, this is a very simple matching of supply and demand problem. This graph and some version of the story about taxis is included in every Economics 101 textbook. Every single economist sitting out here, and I know we've got a bunch, every single one of you knows the story about taxis and how it is not the right reflection of a supply and demand curve. But knowing that this is a basic supply and demand problem doesn't make it feel any better when it doesn't work. And so do we find ourselves with an intractable problem? Do we find ourselves 300 years later with the smartest people in transportation in the room simply unable to solve this? To date, yes. And the answers that I have are not answers for 50 years in the future, and I'm not even sure I can better describe for you the reality of the status quo. What I'm saying is that it actually takes fairly small changes because the underlying problem is fairly simple. It turns out that we all have cell phones in our pockets now. Everyone in this room does, and increasingly, everyone around the world does. An Android smartphone, what now counts as a smartphone, is $20, or it's $0, and all over the world. Meanwhile, we have these incredible data sets that can actually shed light, as Eric was saying, onto existing curves of supply and demand. And so suddenly we have mobility, we have personalization, we have data. Is this a possible solution? I think it is. I think what you get when you match the idea that every one of us has a phone in our pocket that's beaming real-time data with incredibly large data sets that can help predict for the suppliers what the demand curve looks like, I think you can serve an incredible number of people with a much smaller number of assets and make a much more efficient use of the labor pool. What does this mean for consumers? The first is just this all got a hell of a lot easier. Full stop. That's it. It turns out that you can just push a button and something happens that used to take 30 minutes or not at all. There's honestly just a simplicity and a convenience here. But that's not the most interesting thing. You can also build choice into the model. Suddenly this idea that you only had one choice, because honestly, this is your only choice, standing on the street corner looking like an idiot, right? If that's your only choice, then we're kind of locked into this system of supply and demand that's very structured and very rigid. But what if we can provide choice? What you get is this. You get average wait times in the biggest cities in the world that barely give me time to finish my beer and sign my check. I can drink pretty fast, so in Mexico City I could probably down my last beer, but maybe not in Chicago. That's what that means for consumers. Response times that were unfathomable just 5 years ago. It also means that as we get scale, we actually get improved response times, which is actually really counterintuitive. Our gracious host is from Stockholm, which deregulated the for-hire transportation market some decades ago now. And what you had was a glut of supply on the market, and it resulted in horrible service levels. Really counterintuitive. But it's only because we weren't able to match that increased pool of supply with an increased pool of demand. You also get transparency. This is fairly simple, but it's a real problem for transportation administrators in cities around the world. How do we ensure that customers have actual visibility into what they're paying for and what they're getting? GPS is a miracle worker in this regard. Finally, you actually get a service that customers want. And I know that it's so easy to say that, but you're talking about reverse churn in the transportation industry. That's really, really hard to find. In almost every other mode of transportation, over a long enough time horizon, people stop using it for one reason or another. Uber hasn't been around very long, and we're just one example of this phenomenon. But in our 4 years, literally over a long enough time horizon, everybody comes back. When was the last time you were able to say that about a taxi? But it's not just for consumers, and again, I think it's important for us to talk more about drivers as a general rule. The data sets involved here provide incredible transparency to the driver. It's not just how can we tell a driver where the passenger is. That's actually fairly easy. That technology is not very hard. But with big data, we can also tell them, what does a city look like in real time? It's not just there's a passenger over here, but it's that there are actually 20 passengers over there, and there are 20 cabs over here and no cabs over there. That's actually a much more complicated problem at first, but as you build more and more data, you empower drivers with more and more information to make smart decisions. Taxi drivers, as much as they're easy to hate on, are actually rational actors. They respond to financial incentives just like the rest of us, and data is how we give them those financial incentives. It also means, most importantly, that drivers make more money. This is plain and simple math. It turns out that a fully utilized vehicle using technology like this, whether it's Uber or any of the other solutions available, can net somewhere between 2 and 4 times what they make in an existing taxi system. Money talks. And it turns out that doing 10 6-minute trips in an hour, as opposed to waiting for one 30-minute trip in an hour, is an incredibly profitable endeavor for the driver. Perhaps most importantly for this crowd, this is really important for cities. So this is the street that I used to live in Washington, D.C. Quiet neighborhood, nice little neighborhood, historically black neighborhood, historically working class neighborhood. You could not get a taxi there to save your life. I think literally, if I needed to save my life, I could not have gotten a taxi. Well, this is Chicago today, and unfortunately that's a little washed out. But what that shows there is what the city of Chicago has designated as historically underserved areas by taxi. And this is a map of Uber trips in Chicago. 4 out of 10 trips in Chicago right now are being done in underserved neighborhoods. 4 out of 10, 40%. It's no longer underserved when it's nearly half. Why is that? It's because when I go to Northeast DC, I know that there's actually a trip waiting for me on the other end. Whereas if you're a taxi driver and there is this fog of war, there is an opaqueness to the world around you, why would you ever risk the gas? Why would you ever risk the time to drive to these neighborhoods? Transparency is incredibly good for drivers as a profit matter, but it's incredibly good for cities that have trouble serving these neighborhoods. Being a taxi driver is also historically a very dangerous business to be in. It's one of the most dangerous professions in the United States in terms of violent crime. So how can we fix that? Just take cash out of the equation. So in the 300 days preceding Uber's entrance to the city of Chicago, the taxi crime looked like the chart on your left. The day that we entered the market and the 300 days following, taxi crime in Chicago decreased by 10%. We don't operate taxis, and yet somehow 10% drop in violent crime in taxis. Simply by doing something as simple as removing cash from the equation, something that the people in this room have wanted to do for a very long time, actually has the result of decreasing crime. It turns out all we have to do is do it, which I know sounds easier said than done. This is not my chart, but I actually think it's really important, especially for the guy like me who's looking to finish his beer before he gets in the car. 10,000 people in the United States die every year on the roads. It's unforgivable. As policymakers, as citizens, that should be an unforgivable sin. And it turns out, by giving people better choices, they will make smarter choices. In the city of Seattle, DUIs decreased by 10% over the time that Uber's been in the market. 10%. I don't know how many lives that equates to in the city of Seattle, but if it's even one, I think cities, that's an improvement. If we can take people like me who want to finish their beer off the road and get them home safely, that's a win for the driver, it's a win for the consumer, but it's certainly a win for a city as well. So we talked a little bit earlier with both Carlo and Eric about kind of the traffic patterns in cities. A recent estimate says that up to 40%, and I think Carlo talked about this in terms of what self-driving cars might do for us someday in the future, but today, up to 40% of traffic in major urban areas is circling looking for parking. 40%. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about how we can improve that incrementally in the coming years. But what if we could just make it so if I wanted to get to work from home, or if I wanted to get from the bar to home, how do I do that without having to look for parking? We can decrease traffic even if we take 10% of people who might circle looking for parking and put them in the cars that are already existing assets. The labor pool is already there. The assets are already there. If we can maximize the utility of those assets, how much traffic can we pull off the road? Even if it's incremental change, it makes a massive difference for cities. So I used this slide earlier for consumers, but I think it's equally important for cities. The OECD has actually produced several reports that talk about the lack of transparency in the transaction that happens in a taxi cab. It's a cash transaction, it's very poorly reported, and the tax revenue lost for cities is in the billions of dollars. But all of these trips are done digitally. It's a cashless transaction, there's a digital record of every trip. We're talking about untold billions in tax revenue that can be tapped, all while increasing the revenue of drivers. Have your cake, and you can eat it too. So this is one of my favorite charts, and it just basically says the world is getting a whole lot smaller. And you can't see it here, so we'll zoom in a little bit. But the short version is that because the world is getting smaller, we have an expectation that our transportation systems travel with us. The minister from Singapore yesterday was talking about, and the minister from New Zealand was talking about it in a different session. There's a theme here that we're increasingly looking at either citizens of our place or visitors to our place that are looking for consistency and predictability in their transportation network. We can now map travel patterns around the world that use Uber, and what we see is that whether you're in Amsterdam or Bogota, whether you're in Bangkok or Brussels, you have the same kind of usage patterns. Fundamentally, as much as we all feel like special unicorns, the problems that have plagued for-hire transportation for a very long time are fundamentally the same. And if we can fix them in one place and we can scale it quickly, then we can fix it everywhere. Not quite everywhere yet. 36 countries and 120 cities is where Uber is today. So why aren't we everywhere is kind of where I'd like to conclude. It's actually not the tech. So Eric actually, I think, made a very good point. Nothing is really a tech problem anymore. Nothing is really a data problem anymore because everything's a tech problem. Everything's a data problem. So why is it that we're in 120 cities and not 12,000 cities? And it comes down to essentially what the group of people in this room can control, which is policy. We can't actually move the taxis or the trains around like pawns on a chessboard. If we could do that, we would have solved all of these problems a long time ago. What we can do is we can use public policy to create financial incentives, to create public interest incentives, to create rational actor incentives that lead people to do the things that we want. Like the watermen on the Thames, when the very first horse and buggy taxis emerged in London, there will be protestations that this is different, that this is bad. Those protestations have succeeded in defending a broken system for 300 years. And so what it takes is the courage of our convictions. The people in this room understand that our system is broken, and they understand that we can do something better. The political will to actually do it is much harder. And it will be a long slog through the mud, and compromises will be made. But I think when we come back to it, for entirely too long, policy in for-hire transportation has not been made with consumers or drivers in mind. It's been made with everybody else in mind. And I think it's long past time that we started making for-hire policy with consumers and drivers, the actual producers and the consumers in mind. Thank you guys very much.
You mentioned conflict. And I mean, you don't fit the traditional business model. So there's been protests. I mean, in Paris, one Uber car got attacked by cab drivers, and there's been authorities that have been trying to shut you down. And the service you provide, I mean, it's something nobody expected. So how much do you think that you have to adapt to regulations that are already there? And how much do you think politics will change for you?
So I think that as with any significant change, you can adapt the innovation, you can adapt the disruption to the status quo. And that's fine, and it works, but what you'll get is marginal change. And I think that we've been in a situation where for-hire transportation has been changing marginally for 300 years. And I frankly think that those marginal changes haven't even kept pace with the world around it. And so that's not to say that the business model can't or won't change, only that we're looking at such monumental gains for the consumer and for the producer that I think we have to make big changes. And if that means there is resistance from the watermen on the Thames, then those are conversations that we should have because they're long overdue.
Okay. Thank you, Corey Owens.
Thank you very much.
So we've been talking a lot about the city, we've been talking a lot about the cars, and now it's time to talk about the parking system. What if that would be intelligent too, showing you the nearest available spot when you need it? Please welcome Richard Harris, who is Solution Director at the International Transportation and Government section of Xerox.
Can I take this down? Can you take that one down? Here, yeah. But I'm speaking at these mics. Oh, I want this one away. Take this away. Moment. Thank you. Okay, we'll do it this way. Morning, everybody. My name is Richard Harris from Xerox. As you probably all know, Xerox is a company that does imaging and data. That's what Xerox has always done, and that's what we will continue to do. I'm here to talk about transportation. So, what you may not know is what we do in intelligent transport systems. We're members of many of the leading organizations which are thought leaders in ITS. So Ertico, ITS America, many of the national ITS associations. We're members of PIARC, the World Road Federation. We're involved in the Michelin Bibendum Challenge, which many of you will know. And we've recently signed an agreement with the University of Michigan, where Xerox scientists at our centers in Park, in Webster, in New York, and in Grenoble, really good scientists are going to be dedicating their time to working on connected vehicle technologies to help us move this forward. The Mobility Transformation Center in Ann Arbor will be launched this September, and the intention is that they will have a fleet of maybe 20,000 vehicles going around that area of Michigan, and we will be involved in that with our research scientists. When it comes to transport, what do? Well, every single year, we process more than $5 billion in road tolls. Every day, we process more than 200 million public transport tickets. one of the things we focus on are the back office systems. And when the only time you notice a back office system is when it's not working properly. So that's why many of you may not know the depth of what we do in transportation. Our vector system that handles the tolling, collects money from many different agencies, does the reconciliation of that money and sends it back out to them. So it's a huge financial operation as well as a tolling operation. So authorities around the world rely on our services, and we're really pleased with the way that we do things at the moment. So moving on, the ITS that I'm involved in, and I should say that my personal ambition is to help unlock the community-wide benefits of ITS. I think all too often, up until now, we've had niche people, niche sectors benefiting. I want to help the community and unlock all the benefits. So when it comes to the authorities, the reason they invest in ITS, it's always one of or a combination of safety, efficiency, mobility, the environment, the economy, and accessibility. When it comes to the more forward-thinking authorities, they also care about the quality of life, health, and inclusion. When we talk about the private sector investing in ITS, why do they do it? They want control, to know exactly what's going on. They want more efficiency. They want compliance. Because for these respectable companies that invest in ITS, they don't want to break the regulations because that's inefficient. They want compliance. They want to be competitive. They want scalability so they can adjust their services up and down. They want to increase and improve service levels, engage with their stakeholders to get loyalty. So these are the driving factors of why the authorities and businesses are investing in ITS. So ITS, everybody's heard of it. It's really, really easy. An ITS system should make things safer, surer, smoother, smarter, and simpler. That's the ambition of an ITS system. They should support policy and business outcomes. They're enabled by technology. They're not about technology. I don't care about the technology. I care about what they do. One of the important things with ITS, any system that's implemented, is to understand the effect that you have. So to capture the benefit. So an example would be, if you did something which gave you an effective increase in road capacity, if you don't measure that increase and capture it, it would just fill up with traffic. But if you measure it and capture it, you can decide how to spend that advantage. Maybe you give more time to pedestrians, or to bicycles, or to buses, or to trucks. But unless you capture that benefit, that gain, it just disappears. And the one thing that every ITS project, demonstration, implementation, deployment has in common, and it's the biggest challenge, is the introduction of this technology always makes us work in a different way. And it's that organizational, institutional challenge which is always the limiting factor on how quickly we manage to deploy things. And when it comes to services, we want to generate and run services which are accepted by the people they're aimed for, convenient, reliable, robust, safe and secure, cost-effective, and fair and consistent. Why wouldn't you? I should say that on the introductory slide, it had me down as coming from the USA. You probably guessed by now that I don't. I come from the UK. And I work for Xerox, and Xerox thinks it's a US company, but actually it's a global company. But I have to explain to my colleagues the difference between how we think in Europe and how they think in the US. In Europe, we think 100 years. Sorry, in Europe, we think 100 miles is a long way. And in the US, they think 100 years is a long time. And us Europeans know that that's not true. So as an illustration, I'm going to just show you my brief development of ITS. So bear with me. So ITS started fairly recently. In 1760, we had there's a bit missing. From 1100 BC, we had the Chinese south-facing chariot. So differential odometer on the wheels. As the chariot went round the corners, the little guy on the top continued to point to his destination. the first example of in-car navigation. In 1760, an Englishman called John Harrison created this watch, which you can see in the Greenwich Museum in London. And for the very first time, we could move across the sea or across the land with a watch that didn't use a pendulum motion, so it kept time. So we solved the longitude problem. So for the first time, we knew exactly where we were on the Earth's surface. 1844, Samuel Morse. Anybody know what he did? Invented the telegraph, and hence the Morse code. So the telegraph meant for the very first time we could send a communication without sending a person. So a huge change. Otis, anybody know what Otis did? The elevator. Yeah, Otis invented the traffic jam. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have these high-rise central business districts with thousands and thousands of people crowded into a small space, creating the traffic jam. So I blame Otis for everything. William Phelps Eno. Everybody heard of him? When he was 9, he went to the opera in New York with his mother. They were in a traffic jam, which involved just 12 carriages, horses and carriages. But they got into traffic jam, and even though there were only 12 carriages, it took more than 2 hours to untangle them and for all the carriages to go on their own way. Smart kid. He thought about this, and he invented the concept of traffic management. So platoons of vehicles taking their turn. So after he'd made his fortune in real estate, he went back to his true love, which was transportation, and he developed many of the systems that we've got today. So he wrote the rules of driving. He set up the traffic management system in New York and Paris and elsewhere. Brilliant. 1912, huge heat wave in America. 1,200 horses died in a fortnight. Imagine that. Absolutely awful. That single event meant that from that moment on, the horse was in the descendancy and the automobile was in the ascendancy in America. So it changed people's thinking. Then the next one is my friend Job Kleinhout. There he is. Looks like a mad Dutch professor, because that's what he was. In 1973, for the very first time on a motorway in the Netherlands, we demonstrated automatic incident detection. So we had a fleet of vehicles that stopped on the motorway. When they stopped, we were alerted in a control center. The first time it had been done, automatic incident detection. The beginnings really of the new age of ITS. And then in 1983, anybody remember? Anybody else old enough to remember the Soviet shooting? Yes, you do, thank you. The Soviet shooting down a Korean airliner over the Sea of Japan. Navigation error. 269 people killed. The consequence of that one act was that the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, made GPS available for civilian applications. And that changed everything, because it meant, for the first time since 1100 BC with the Chinese chariot, we had a really effective way of knowing exactly where we were on the Earth's surface. So that is why this is important. It's these events which change the way that we work and operate. This is fairly quick and simple. People travel in the way that they're comfortable with. We all travel in the way that we're used to. We have our set areas we want to travel, the ways we go there, where we park. This is an example from London. This is London Underground. So if, for instance, you're at this station, which is the Embankment, and you want to go to Covent Garden, you can see that you have some choices. You can go up the Northern Line and change at Leicester Square. You could go up this one and change at Piccadilly. It's a network, so you have choices of how you make this journey. Simple, yeah. Everybody's familiar with this. There is a different way. Step outside of the station and walk. And you can walk in 7 minutes from the Embankment to Covent Garden. But unless you know that, you will never learn it, because you actually walk almost as far in the tunnels, changing lines in the underground. But once people know it, once you show them a way of doing something, they think, I can do that. And that's one of the things that we've done with this parking system that we're going to talk about. So Los Angeles face the same problems of all major cities. We've already heard circling traffic, looking for spaces. So we're talking on-street parking here, not off-street, on-street parking. People driving around looking for spaces in their favourite place. Now, the objective of what we did in Los Angeles was not to increase revenue. It was to reduce the amount of circling traffic, causing pollution, congestion, and wasting time. So what do? Simple. We installed sensors at over 6,000 parking meters. We developed a management tool called Merge, which can take all of the data, so maintenance, occupancy, the money, everything that you can possibly conceive of, collect all that data, manage it, and show it to the authorities on a dashboard which is simple for them to understand and simple for them to operate. And the real trick is that there are two sides of this story. One is being able to change the prices on on-street parking and change them automatically. Normally when an authority introduces on-street parking, they put the meters in and the prices are fixed because it's too difficult to change them. And when they do change them, they change them completely. The system in Los Angeles uses the data that we manage and we extract intelligence from in order to achieve the policy objectives. And the policy objectives, you remember, are to reduce circling traffic. And the way you do that is for on-street parking, you try to get occupancy in the region of 80–85% full. So that means there are always spaces available. And you can influence people's behavior by changing the prices. And it's not just changing the price as a punishment. When you change the price and you tell them about some cheaper available parking nearby, what are you doing? You're informing them and educating them of an option. And when they choose that, they think maybe this area is not so bad and it's quicker for me to park and I save some money. So it works for the consumer because they get better information. We provide the data to app developers, so they get the data on their smartphones, they get the data on their navigation system, they get the data on the websites, they get it in different ways. So even though we only increased prices at 27% of the spaces and decreased prices at 60%, the revenue went up 2%. So it wasn't the objective, but even though we lowered some and raised a few others, the revenue actually went up. The circling traffic reduced by 10%. Now this is not like the earlier presentation with the stock market where you could see all these fluctuations. This is a gradual process where currently, I'll check with my colleague, but currently I think the pricing is only changed maybe once a month. Yeah. As people become more familiar with the system, you can make it more dynamic. But it's a question of educating people. So the dynamic pricing has influenced driver behavior. It's helped spread them to different spaces. It's increased revenue. It's created a better service for people. It's raised the political agenda. It's raised parking to a new high level on the political agenda. And most importantly, it gives the authorities a flexible policy tool. So if there are areas where they want to discourage people from parking because of a parade or some roadworks or some maintenance, they can do that. And they can create buffer zone by changing the pricing. So I think it's a fantastic system. It was developed in-house by our research scientists, and we're really pleased with it, and we think that it has huge potential. So a couple of illustrations. Block face, so you can see where the parking spaces are. A complete picture, so this is managing different types of data. It's managing the occupancy data, the payments, paid and not paid, the policy areas where no parking is allowed, maintenance and enforcements. So all that on a dashboard, and you think, okay, but this is what the public can see. Where are the spaces? What are the prices? What's my criteria? How does it work for me? And what does the authority want to see? He wants to see the cash. And with this, he gets accurate picture. So for me, this is a real policy tool. It's exploiting the huge amount of data that's coming from all of those sensors and the other systems. And it's a plug-and-play system because we don't demand that a city would throw away all its legacy systems, just plug and play. And it's not just my opinion, it's also the opinion of the International Transport Forum. So we're really proud to get the award yesterday and look forward to rolling this out and proving it even further. So thank you very much.
Microphones. So, Richard, you tried this out in LA, and I'm curious, how far away are you from, the app that will tell you this is the nearest spot?
Not far. Well, we have it already. We have it already. The thing is that what some people get confused about is they think that this system would reserve a spot for you, and it doesn't. Every time I go to America, my wife reminds me to watch what I say because they carry guns. So the last thing I want is for somebody to think, that's my space, it's reserved, and somebody else is parking there, because these people carry guns and there's no messing about with them. But with the app, what's available, it's there, it's working.
Okay. I'd like to welcome all the other speakers up on stage now and open up the floor for questions from you in the audience. We have a couple of, you can take one of the handheld microphones, and Carlo, you get the other one. And just raise your hand and then maybe state your name and the company or organization you're working for before you ask your question. Come here and stand all together so it looks better on camera too. So, we have any questions from you? It must be something. It's a really interesting guys. Yes, in the back. Hold on, we'll get you a microphone.
My name's Clay Lucas. I'm a journalist from an Australian newspaper called The Age. My question's for Corey. In my town, about 30 drivers who are using Uber were recently issued with $1,700 penalties for using your service. I wanted to know, in how many cities where you've tried to establish a base has that happened? Is Australia rare for trying to stop Uber getting established?
Sorry. There we go. So what happened in Australia is actually pretty par for the course. So it's not uncommon for some combination of a local regulator or the incumbent for-hire industry to resist passionately, sometimes as in Paris and Milan with violence, other times as in Brussels or I think Sydney and Melbourne both, a citation. This is not uncommon, and I think it comes back to a little bit about what we were talking about earlier, where there are ways to improve transportation systems that are incremental and that are less likely to bother anybody. But I think it's our contention that the for-hire transportation regime needs to be bothered, that it's actually long overdue that we tackle very hard problems with big solutions. And as in the case in Australia, sometimes that's going to upset people. But I think if drivers make more money and passengers get where they're going safely and quickly, that's a ticket that I'm willing to pay for.
And we have a question there from you, a gentleman on the side.
I'm Tom Kern with the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. Great presentations. I think the challenge for all of us is how do we take these innovations to scale? How do we get them more widespread across our cities and countries? And I wonder, and I open this to any of you, what are the barriers to getting this to the scale that we would love to see, and how do you overcome them?
That's an interesting question, is it not?
Sure. Well, happy to start. From our point of view, I will tell you what we do at the university, which is basically try to quantify one way to actually promote the deployment is actually to quantify some of these aspects. So this is what some of the research is doing, or developing systems and so on, so that then others can do it. But I think what we're seeing more and more is actually then, in order to implement them, as in the case of Uber, we've known each other since the beginning, since when it started. That actually goes via startups and people who then risk and try to do it. And so I think perhaps the best way is really to create a rich ecosystem where innovation can happen and be deployed by allowing people just a bunch of kids in a garage to develop their ideas. And I think we're seeing that more and more. There's two encouraging things. The first one is we're seeing that more and more in this field. You know, the field of the conversion of digital and physical is very, very hot for venture capital, for instance, today. But the other thing we're seeing is that just kind of in the past, everybody thought it was very difficult to clone Silicon Valley. Many people tried to clone Silicon Valley or Boston area or some of the innovation hubs. Were very difficult to clone elsewhere. And actually, the French tried, did something called Sophia Antipolis, which is a wonderful place, but but it's not really, it doesn't have those innovation dynamics that we're supposed to develop there. Now, I think over the past 5 years, we've seen something different, that for all the way from the Silicon Roundabout in London to Tel Aviv to Singapore and so on, actually these things are starting to replicate across the globe. So I think it is about really promoting, creating a fertile ground in order to allow people to develop some of these apps. In the end, sometimes it's just a simple app and can make a big impact, as we saw in the case of Uber.
Richard?
I think we have an irresistible proposition with our merge system and dynamic parking. Cities are running out of money. Parking is one of the main sources of revenue. Managing parking properly can encourage people to visit more retail outlets and help keep businesses operating. The system that we have can also reduce congestion. And I think that generally one of the benefits of ITS systems is that you can make an impact much more quickly than you can with more expensive and lengthy infrastructure projects. So I think that there's a huge potential market for more intelligent parking, not just with our system, but with other systems that inform drivers. So I think that it's an area that has been ignored for far too long. We have intelligent driving, we have intelligent travelers. Now let's have some intelligent stopping. When is the right time to stop, to park, to change mode, or to move to your destination?
This makes me a little curious. How has authorities, cities, and so on, how have they reacted to what you're doing? Are they welcoming you with open arms, or what's happening when you're presenting what you're doing?
The first time that we did any kind of visualization of crime in Oakland, as soon as we made that information public, the city shut us down.
Really?
Terms of service attack. I don't think it was a malicious thing. I think it was just, why are you scraping our data? Why are you doing this to us, weird small company in the mission?
They were scared of your findings, or what were they scared of?
I think it was more the normal bureaucratic response to something weird, which is to say no. And what we found is that within about 3 months, by talking to the city, it was an opportunity for us to reach out to the city's police department and build trust with them. I mean, that was, I think, the fun part. If we had tried to call up the city's police department and say, hey, can we please have access to your data, we'd still be waiting and there would be no project. So the sort of act of being proactive about going and getting the data and then making it very, very publicly accessible, I think, was the thing that sparked the conversation about how to engage with a municipality.
And you've had similar problems, Corey.
I think this comes back a little bit to what Carlo was saying about it's an ecosystem question as much as it is anything else, right? It's an attitudinal shift, right? So take Sydney, right, as one example, but Sydney's not the only example. Perth, on the other hand, has decided, actually, we think this is pretty interesting and we're going to let this play out. Or take London, where they said, actually, this looks like it's protecting consumers and improving service. And then what you have is 10,000 taxis threatening to go on strike. So I think it's easy sometimes to think about, especially municipal governments, as being inherently anti-innovation, inherently resistant to change. And certainly there's an element of that all around the world. But I think fortunately, there are examples increasingly of cities and states and countries that are willing to say, what we've done before has not served our population well. And it's time for us to let new, big, bold ideas play out.
Can I respond to the scale question for a second? Sorry. But as far as scaling these kinds of things, I think it's not so much, at least as far as the visualization and the kind of mapping work is doing, it's not so much a question of how do we scale it, but how do we respond to the scale that exists. I was talking to one of the guys from IBM yesterday, and he was saying that A lot of the roads that exist, there's basically fiber optic networks that have been laid alongside the roads to power the blinking signs that say go left or right, or here, this is the time. And that one of the things that you need to account for in those fiber optic lines is the noise, essentially, that comes from having these cars drive along the side of the road. Well, it turns out that that noise is actually something that you can use to measure the traffic that's going along the road. So we've already got and developed an incredibly efficient system for tracking traffic that was entirely an unintended consequence of just putting wires alongside the road. So for me, I'm more concerned about sort of responding to the kind of absolutely gigantic opportunity of being able to kind of take the instrumentation that we've laid and do something with it that's quite efficient and interesting.
Yeah, but I actually want to say, all the cities we've been working with actually have been very, very, I mean, we see a lot of excitement in cities all over the world about actually embracing new technology. I think mayors in particular, they really want to change the quality of life of cities. They want to give new services to citizens. Every mayor now is talking about smart cities. Sometimes they do not even know what it is. I heard a mayor who came and said, we put, bicycle in the cities, we're a smart city. I mean, they sometimes, they don't even know, but they want to jump on a lot of technological development. So I don't think that the cities or public officials are in particular here being conservative. I think the people who are being conservative, is in the case of Uber, as we saw, is actually some of the people, who are the same people like, when the train went to the west of the United States. And at that point, the diligences started assaulting the train. And started to stop the train. But of course, we know the story. Then the train went, and people who jumped on the train are the ones who then made history, and the other people were swept away by the train. And I think so. I think the resistance to the system mostly came for little interest groups, sometimes very vocal, such as taxi drivers, or in other fields, some of the others who are threatened by the change. But I think mayors today are particularly innovative, actually jumping on a lot of innovation.
I just wanted to say finally that. My presentation has been kind of the policy overview. I'm not one for the technical details. I normally do these things on my own, but I'm fortunate today that my colleague Ono, stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up. I'm going to keep saying it, you stand up. Who's standing up there, you'd notice. He's the guy that actually invented all this merge stuff. So if you have detailed technical questions, I'm happy not to answer them. You can approach him.
Okay, thank you so much. Corey Owens, Eric Rodenbach, Carlo Ratti, and Richard Harris. And thank you all for listening and participating in this session. And a summary of it will be up on the ITF website in a couple of hours or so. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day.